you for joining us today. If you are here for the Community Health Training Institute's Public Health Past, Present, and Future, you are in the right place. In a second, I'm going to hand it over to our trainers, both Tanayo and Ben, to get us started. But I wanted to give you a little bit of information. If you are new here and have not been to one of our trainings before, welcome. And if you're returning, also welcome. Happy to see some familiar names and faces in the room today. My name is Gina Rodriguez.
Hello.
I use the she, her pronouns, and I serve as the Associate Director for the Community Health Training Institute. And the Community Health Training Institute is a project that is funded. Hello, welcome. You are in the Community Health Training Institute training. If you are meant to be here, you're in the right place. So as I was saying, we are funded by both HRIA, Health Resources in Action, which is a public health institute in Boston, Massachusetts, and also by the Massachusetts Department of Public Health. And that partnerships helps us bring you these trainings absolutely free. And so we have trainings all throughout the year. This is our first online training for this year, so welcome. We're very excited to have you. And we have training scheduled throughout the rest of the year. So if you have an opportunity, please feel free to visit us on our website to find out more about our project and about trainings that we have to offer. And you can find us at hrainstitute.org. Our website is also the host of the only coalition roster for the state of Massachusetts. So we ask if you are a representative of a coalition today, or a member, or a lead of a coalition, please feel free to add your information or update your information if you've already done so. And then last but not least, feel free to connect with us on social media. We are active on Twitter, HRIA Institute, and also you can sign up for our newsletter so you can get updates on trainings we've got coming up. We have resources available on our website as well. And if you scroll to the bottom of our website on the homepage, you can add yourself to the newsletter. So I think that might be it. Welcome again. We're excited to have you, and I'm going to hand it over to Tanayo and Ben to say hello and introduce themselves and get us started.
Sure, I can say hello first, and then maybe Eli, you can introduce yourself, and then we'll end with Ben and circle back. So hello, everybody. Good morning. My name is Tanayo Crow. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a program associate with the Community Health Training Institute. I've been on this team for about 4 years, almost 4.5, which is crazy. And I'm also an MPH student currently at the University of Minnesota. So I'm coming to you live from Central Time. It is 9:08 a.m. in Minneapolis. So if I am a little bit slow getting going today, that is why. But very excited to be here with you all. And I'm going to let Eli say hello.
Thanks, Tanayo. Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Happy Monday. My name is Eli Adler-Cohen. I use he, him, his pronouns, and I am an administrative coordinator here at Health Resources in Action, specifically doing some work with the Community Health Training Institute. And I'm excited to be here. I'm going to be doing tech support for us today. So if anyone has any Zoom questions or problems or needs a question answered, feel free to send me a personal message. I think I'm pretty sufficient, so I should be able to help. But yes, feel free to reach out. And yeah, happy to be here. I'll throw it over to Ben.
Thanks, Eli. Hi, everybody. Ben Wood. Use he, him pronouns, and I'm Senior Director of Policy and Practice at Health Resources in Action. Also really happy to be here with everybody this morning. I see a bunch of folks who I know, especially some folks I know from my days at the Department of Public Health, where actually I did a lot of work with CHTI. So it was really fun to be on this side of the coin, working with the HRA team. So happy to be here, and pass it back over to Tanayo.
Awesome. Thank you, Ben. We're super excited to host you all this morning. Thank you for coming. I know it's early on a Monday. So Eli, let's go ahead and pull up the slide deck, and we're just going to walk you through a few hellos, welcomes, etc., and then give you a chance to say hello to each other. Noting that there's kind of a big group, we're going to do that in a breakout space, so you hopefully have a chance to, speak in a smaller setting. All right, awesome. So I think we're into year 3 of the pandemic, so I'm guessing a lot of you are very familiar with Zoom, but we do want to, try not to make assumptions about people's comfortability with this platform. So just wanted to point out a few things you can use today. On the left-hand side of your fun little bar at the bottom of your screen is that mute unmute button. Feel free to stay muted if you don't like, if you have background noise, etc. If there's things happening in your space. If you are at a kind of quiet area and you want to be able to sort of jump in more quickly, we welcome you to come off mute and share your voice into this space. Similar with the start-stop video, of course, we love to see your faces, but if you're not comfortable or you have things going on, you can use that button to turn off your camera. And then I'll just say, feel free to participate in the chat today. I mentioned we have sort of a slightly larger group, so if you feel like you're not able to maybe speak up for whatever reason, we welcome you to share your voice in the chat. We will do our best to make sure we're pulling out those comments and bringing your voice into the space. We are going to be using the annotate function today, but I'm just going to explain that when we get to it so we don't confuse anybody. And then the last thing I'll say here is you can sort of toggle between views. So if you're in speaker view, that means you're probably only seeing my face. If you would like to see the faces of other folks in this space, feel free to click that button. It'll change it to gallery view, and then you can see all those little boxes. And I think unless there are questions, and Eli, as he said, if you just want to ask him questions throughout the day, feel free. I think we'll just move on to the next slide. Awesome. So I won't spend too long here, but just noting we will be using breakout rooms, I think 2 or 3 times today. So just kind of a quick overview. When you're in those breakout spaces, you'll be able to use all of the same functions, in addition to being able to ask us in the main room for any assistance. If you do run into an issue, you can just click the button. I think it's like a little question mark inside of a box and just say, hey, we need help. I think there are some new functionalities in the breakout space, but I'm not super brushed up on them. So just going to leave those out for now. But if you do seem to find anything fun to play with, feel free. Next slide. And then I think this is our last Zoom piece. Yes. So if you are having any connectivity issues, we definitely recommend joining by phone audio. The way that you do that is you just click that little caret top next to your mute button and you select the option that says join via phone audio. And then you'll get this little box that pops up and it just gives you step-by-step instructions to join. And you'll essentially just be calling into the training, and you can do that while you have your camera on, or if it's easier just to turn off your camera. And just listen to us. Just listen to us. I like forgot the word for just using your ears. I'm sorry, I told you I'm tired. You can do that as well. So any questions about Zoom or phones or cameras or anything at this point? No. Okay, awesome. Y'all are experts. Well, let's move on. Okay, so what are we going to be doing today? Our learning objectives are here. So we're going to be exploring a timeline, which I'm really excited. We're really excited to share with you, and really making connections between historical transgressions in public health and the current mistrust that we've really seen emerge in the last few years in this field. We're going to be thinking about public health history as it pertains to issues of health equity. So that's really going to be our framework for today. And we're really going to do this sort of through the lens of case studies, connecting our current views to things that have happened in the past, and like really thinking with you all collectively about how we want to see public health evolve. Next slide, please. So our agenda, just briefly, we're in that welcome and intro space. As I mentioned, we're going to do a quick equity framework. We're going to think about that timeline, those case studies, take a quick break, and then sort of use that in the second half to look forward and do some interesting group activities, and really kind of pull on your expertise in this room. I think I didn't mention this at the top, but one thing that we really value in our training spaces is you all. Collectively, we really want to hear from you. We want to hear what you're thinking about, what you're working on, and we really see you all as the experts, and we're just here to kind of facilitate the conversation. So looking forward to hearing. Sorry, Asha, did you have a comment or just? No? Awesome. And then I think last slide before we let you all say hello. So we like to do group agreements just to kind of hold space together. Our first one, as I mentioned, if you can, we invite you to leave your camera on. Of course, I fully recognize not everyone is comfortable doing that, so please only do what you're comfortable with. If you're not speaking, you can, of course, stay muted. If you are in a quieter space, as I said, feel free to take yourself off mute. Sometimes that makes it easier to kind of jump in. We also have take space, make space here. So really, we invite you to share your voice however you're comfortable. And if you notice that maybe others aren't sharing as often, maybe you take a moment and see if they want to jump in first before speaking again. But again, we're not trying to like dissuade you from talking. It's more of just to recognize the space that you are taking. Respecting others and yourself, this should be pretty easy for all of you. And then take care of yourself. I know I'll say this again, but some of the stuff we're going to talk about is pretty hard to hear. I think it's hard to read about. We're not going to do anything that's going to sensationalize it, but just want to make sure that you're all taking the space you need to care for yourselves. If you need a bathroom break, if you need a water break, whatever you need, please go do it. And then finally, we ask that you share lessons and not details. So I think a lot of us maybe know each other, or like there are going to be some familiar faces in here. So if you are sharing an anecdote or a story, just trying to keep names out of it would be awesome. Okay, since these are group agreements, I want to make sure that y'all are on board. So could I get some thumbs up if people agree, thumbs down if you don't, and I'll just kind of scroll through my little slides. I'm seeing some nice little emojis. We love that. Awesome. Thank you all so much. And let's move to the next slide. And I think it's time for some small group intros. So Eli is going to create some breakout rooms. And while you're in those breakout rooms, if you don't mind sharing your name, if you'd like, you can share your pronouns, where you're joining from, so your organization, maybe your city or county or state. And then the quick icebreaker question, and you don't have to use this, this is just a suggestion, but what's your favorite winter pastime? So I'll paste those in the chat while Eli creates the rooms. Any questions about this before we kind of send you off? Nope. All right. So I think, Eli, whenever you're ready, we'll give you about 5 to 7 minutes just to say hello to each other.
This meeting is being recorded.
I know you always get that weird pop-up. Awesome. So does anyone want to share a favorite winter pastime that either they shared or someone else shared? Just would love to hear if y'all talked about it. You can put it in the chat too if you don't want to talk. Just curious.
Watching movies and hot chocolate, sitting by the fire.
Incredible.
We had a bit of a consensus on soups. Mine is turkey soup. Turkey soup seemed to be an issue, but it was kind of fun.
Nice. And I see outdoor ice skating. All right, lovely. I see.
I feel like I enlightened my group with this idea and someone brought up hot chocolate, but I love to mix hot chocolate and coffee together and then sip it while enjoying the Christmas tree glow with the lights when it's dark out. So if y'all have hot chocolate in your house right now and coffee, you can go make this wonderful concoction.
That sounds amazing. I pretty much exclusively drink peppermint mochas in the holiday season. So that sounds like right up my alley. Anyone else want to share? Just give you all a few more seconds if you wanted to jump in. All right, cool. In that case, I think I'm passing it off to Ben and we're going to jump into some content. Thank you all for doing that.
Thank you so much, Niall. Thank you, everybody, for sharing. I was sharing that winter is my absolute favorite season, but it really does come down to whether or not it's a good winter, and a good winter means it's got to be cold, it's got to be snowy, it's got to be it's got to have the conditions for outdoor ice skating. I'm totally into that too. Can't wait for all that stuff to happen. All right, so we're gonna start out here with just with us talking at you just a little bit to set some context and to and sort of to let you all know where we're coming from when we're talking about and considering issues related to health equity. So we want to start here with this statement that and understanding that the ongoing impact of institutional and structural racism on communities and people of color created reinforcing health crises during the pandemic. This idea that there was disproportionate impacts directly related to the virus, so morbidity and mortality from COVID-19, but also added burdens felt across many social and physical domains. Everything from discrimination, experience of discrimination, and the experience of stress and violence, experiences related to housing, right on down the line. Actually, I'm hearing a little bit of noise. If you can go on mute, that'd be great. Thank you very much. Because the conversation about history, which is what we're trying to frame this conversation around, and its consequences for the present, it really is a conversation about inequities, and we wanted to start here and let you know how we're considering and thinking about inequity. So history really should be our guide for understanding why inequitable impacts were experienced in communities of color, and the fact that these disproportionate impacts were totally predictable is really the key question we must be grappling with. So how can we move to a place where these outcomes are not so predictable is really the key question, and history can be our guide. Next slide, please, Eli. Thanks. So that these inequities were predicted really does depend on your understanding and sort of thinking around what does create inequity. So our team understands that health outcomes are the result of a very complex interplay of the conditions of people's lives and behaviors. So everything's sort of in the middle piece of this graphic here. So educational opportunity, socioeconomic status, what you're exposed to in your physical environment, what you're exposed to in your social environment as it relates to violence or unsafe housing, those sorts of things, right? And that those conditions and the behaviors that relate to those conditions are built on a system of advantage based on race and other socially defined characteristics, which is what's on the left-hand side of the graphic here. So this image, courtesy of the Boston Public Health Commission, it's also really widely used at Mass DPH, but I'm pretty darn sure that it originated with the Boston Public Health Commission, and it's a really great way to sort of situate an understanding of what we classically call the social determinants of health in public health circles. And its relation found at a foundational level to racism and other systems of oppression. Next slide, please. That there is a system of advantage based on race means that to advance health equity, we have to advance racial equity. So accordingly, our team affirms the following: that racial inequity looks the same across systems, that socioeconomic differences do not explain racial inequity, which that's a really key point, which I think gets conflated all the time. And inequities are caused by systems, not necessarily a direct result of people's culture and behavior. These three core affirmations and understandings come from an analytic and database framework called the groundwater approach from the Racial Equity Institute. If folks have not seen or read the groundwater approach, we can drop a link to that document. It's also cited here in the slides. You can find it yourself. It is a really great, very easy read. It's not long, and it is data-based, and it is an analytical framework, and it backs up these statements. So these statements are not just beliefs. These statements are borne out in the data. Next slide, please. All right, so if inequities are caused by systems, we kind of need to define what systems actually are and how we think about them. so we can understand better how to change them, right? Change them in a positive way. So this is really critical for all of our work, and it's especially important as we try to understand how history can inform our future. So can you click one more time, Eli? I think a quote should come up. Yeah, there we go. Great. So this framework was developed by a public health consultancy called FSG in a paper that they termed the water of systems change. And in it, there's this quote that you see on the screen here that says, "Real and equitable progress requires exceptional attention to the detailed and often mundane work of noticing what is invisible to many." So we found that FSG's framework here is super helpful in beginning to translate concepts of sort of why racial inequities exist to really sort of thinking about how to advance toward a state of racial equity. And that's by concretely naming and describing the various levels and components of systems in which all of our work plays out on a daily basis. So what we did at HRA, we took that original framework, which was sort of a basic inverted triangle with 6 equal sized boxes to the visual you see here. And we did this because we wanted to explore and convey visually how much of our systems are invisible below the surface of what we work on and think about and consider on a daily basis. And this sort of iceberg glacier graphic helps to illustrate the interconnectedness also of these different conditions is really all part of a whole. And that's a key point. These are not static sort of levels. The concepts are interconnected and really sort of trying to get to this point of understanding of the policies and practices, the things that we do on a daily basis are influenced very, very significantly in an ongoing way by what's underneath the water. So let's just walk through it. Let's just stay here on this slide. We don't need to go to the next definition slide, Eli. So what you see above the water are the parts of a system that are the most explicit and visible. The policies, sort of things that are sort of in that formal space of government or institutional rules, organizational rules and regulations, those sorts of things. Practices, so quite literally the procedures and guidelines that we follow and that are part of our work on a daily basis. And then resource flows, how money moves, how information flows, and other sort of assets and how they're allocated and distributed. And so these are sort of often anyway, the most explicit of the 6 conditions. They can be certainly obscured by lack of transparency, but they are the sort of things that are talked about on a regular basis, and the sort of the conditions that we face and are sort of working through on a daily basis. And so what lies right underneath them, they're sometimes visible, but very often they are not. And they are often obscured from any sort of real introspection or critique. So relationships and connections, quite literally the quality of connections and the communication that occurs amongst people in a system. And then power dynamics, how the distribution of decision-making power exists, and sort of the formal and informal influence amongst individuals or organizations. And then below that, totally invisible, often anyway, are the mental models, which are these sort of really large, embedded, super hard to change ways of thinking, right? That really deeply impact the conditions above it. So as a definition, mental models are habits of thought, deeply held beliefs, and assumptions, and really sort of the taken for granted ways of operating that influence how we think. And how we behave. And we're going to be coming back to thinking about and critiquing our own mental models later in the session. So we want to take a little pause there and take any questions that might be popping up for anybody as they're sort of thinking about either the health equity framing that just was introduced or this sort of understanding of systems and these six key conditions. So we can take questions directly in chat. People can raise their hand and speak into the space here, but we also want to do this little annotation exercise just to get a little bit of a snapshot of what your current work looks like in relation to these conditions. So basically what we're going to ask you to do is, and Tanaya, who's much better at actually explaining anything in the text space, is going to explain how to do this, but really what we want to do, you can go to the next slide, Eli. Next one after that. We just actually want to pause, go back real quick, Eli. This is, you'll get these slides. We just have the definitions written out for you, so you can review them and have them accessible to you. But yeah, please, next slide, Eli. Great. All right. So what we're really interested in doing is just in this, again, this is just a little snapshot here. You think about your day-to-day work. What are the conditions that you are focusing on mostly? And we want you to put a little star next to those conditions. And then put a little heart next to conditions that you're excited to learn more about or explore further, and then a question mark for any of the conditions that you have more questions about. And Tanaya is going to explain how you actually do that.
All right, so to use that annotate function, if you look at the top of your screen, you should see a little green bar that says you are viewing Eli's screen. Next to that is a little black box that says view options. If you click view options in the dropdown, you should see something that says annotate. And if you click annotate, you're going to get a fun little toolbar that pops up. So I'm just going to do it as I'm saying it because that's always helpful for me. So now that I see my little toolbar, you can click where it says stamp and you can kind of select through these different symbols that we have. So the star, the heart, and the question mark. If anyone's having issues with that, I can say that all again, and or feel free to just like throw things in the chat too if you're like, I really don't get this and I want to participate. But it looks like a few of you are getting it going. I'm gonna see if I can turn off your names because that's very busy looking. 1 second, let's see.
Eli, this is Wendy Judd. When I do my drop down, I don't have that choice. Mine just says original size or request remote control.
Oh, interesting.
You can just,
unsure. Anyone have any insight? Sorry, Ben, I didn't mean to cut you off.
I was just saying, we don't have to worry about the tech, Wendy, or anybody else. You can just drop into the chat any of the, you could just put into the chat any of these answers that you're able to. That's probably the
Okay.
Yeah, it's possible you don't have maybe the most updated version of Zoom sometimes, or sometimes Zoom just like decides not to cooperate. So no worries if y'all can't use all of these functions.
Well, it looks like it's working for lots of folks, and not surprisingly, the conditions that most people are working in on a daily basis are those that are up on the top of the iceberg. So the policies, practices, and resource flows. Although a lot of you who are seemingly intentionally thinking about and working on relationships, connections, and power dynamics on a regular basis, which is amazing to hear. And some of you which are regularly critiquing your mental models, which is even more amazing to hear. And lots of questions about mental models and lots of hearts actually all over the place, which is kind of cool. So we are going to be coming back to talking about mental models after we do this sort of deeper dive into some of the timeline and history that Tanaya is going to share. But I just want to pause again really briefly. If there's any like burning questions that somebody has, they want to get out about the conditions of systems change, now is your space to do so. But if not, we can also just keep moving forward. Cool. All right. Tanaya, I think we can probably move on.
All right, let's go ahead and clear all those lovely hearts and stars and question marks. Eli, I think you can do that on your end. If not, let me know. Perfect. Okay, so I think actually I'm gonna take over screen sharing. So let me make sure I have that up while Eli closes his. Okay. And bear with me. So I'm working on 2 screens, which is unusual for me. So if I'm like pivoting back and forth, it's not because I'm not paying attention. It's because I can't remember which screen I'm supposed to be looking at. So, okay. We are going, oops, sorry. Zoom, stop. Okay. We are going to be spending some time walking through this timeline. And I think, Eli, do you mind popping this link in the chat if you haven't already? I wanted to preface a couple of things. The first logistical ones, I can't see all of your faces while I'm sharing. So if you do have a question or a comment, feel free to unmute yourself and ask it. I'll do my best to kind of watch the chat, but if I miss it, it's not because I don't care. It's because I cannot see you.
Niall, I'll be monitoring the chat too and
Perfect.
lifting things up.
Awesome. So yeah, so feel free to like just jump in, interrupt me. That's totally fine, especially on this like awkward Zoom sphere. So that was one thing I wanted to say. The other thing I wanted to say is so since we're thinking about this kind of through this equity framework, one thing that we wanted to be really intentional about was not starting in like 1848 with the cholera pandemic in London and the John Snow, story that I think a lot of you are probably really familiar with. If you're familiar with public health at all, that's probably the story you've heard. So we are going to be kind of starting way back when, but don't panic when you see 10,000 BCE. I promise I won't spend forever there, even though I could. My little caveat to all of this is that I studied history in college, so this stuff is really exciting for me. And you might have to rein me in. I told my team already, like if I start just like blabbing on about one thing, like tell me to wrap it up and keep going. And I invite you all to do the same. If you're like, she's just been talking forever, feel free to jump in. We are going to be kind of stopping along the way. I'll ask you questions. You'll have a chance to share any thoughts, etc. 2 more things I wanted to say before kind of jumping in. One of them, as I mentioned at the top of the training, is that we are going to be highlighting some case studies that really are centered around transgressions in public health, which means they're not necessarily easy to hear about or talk about. My goal there is not to get too in the weeds, but I really wanted to make sure that we're pulling out like very, very real instances of trauma that have happened throughout time, and hopefully that can help sort of illustrate where we're going in the second half of this training. And so again, if any of that is like, I can't hear this, I don't want to listen to it, that's completely fine. I like really want you all to take care of yourselves first. And then the last thing I want to say, because I have the platform right now, is that one thing I think that comes up a lot, especially when we think about public health kind of as it gets portrayed, if we think about some of the things that are going to come up throughout this timeline, is it's really easy, I think, to say like, oh, history repeats itself, right? That's something that I hear a lot. And I want to sort of push back on that and ask you to think about how that context sort of implies inevitability. And I really think what this timeline shows us is that none of this was inevitable, right? So the things that we're going to talk about didn't happen on accident. It wasn't some, constant march of time leading to points A, B, and C. These are things that happened because people built systems that made them happen. So I want to just kind of push that sort of fallback that like, oh, we just see these things over and over because history repeats itself. I don't necessarily think that's entirely true. Okay, now that I can jump back down from my soapbox, we'll get started. So starting on the far left of this timeline, and feel free to either follow along on my screen, or if it's easier for you to just like put me away and follow along on your own, that's totally fine. So the Neolithic and Agricultural Revolution, which we date to about 10,000 BCE, we're starting here mostly because I think that's really where public health started. If we think about public health not as like an institution, but just like as a way of thinking about like disease and the world and how people interact with each other, this is what happened first. So we started building towns, we started farming, we built some cities, like we talk about sort of the rise of civilization. around this time. And for me, like the second people started settling down and like living in close quarters is the second that diseases started to spread really, really easily. And that's what sort of necessitated public health responses. So that's why we're starting here. And I promised you I wouldn't spend too long there, so I'm not going to. I'm reining myself in. And so kind of moving forward in time, if we jump into like 1700 BCE, I had to leave this in there, I'm sorry. So Hammurabi's code is one of the first written examples we have of a time when people sat down and were like, we're gonna think about how to like interact with each other so that people don't get sick. If you're curious, I encourage you to do some more research on this, but essentially there were rules about like if someone is sick, you can't like go into their house. So even back then, 1700 BCE, we knew about quarantine, right? I think that's really cool. In ancient Greece, we had some things kind of emerge around what we'd probably think of today as like modern epidemiology. So they were really concerned about like bad air and bad water. They had some big ideas of how things like malaria were spreading, but of course didn't have, germ theory or anything like that to kind of contextualize it. And then the other thing I wanted to say in this box is I think it's really cool that if we look back at like ancient China, India, Egypt, and the Incan powers, we can see that they were building sewage and drainage systems, right? So like even in, what do I have here? 323 BCE, they were already recognizing like people are getting sick if we don't get rid of our waste, right? Like maybe that seems really simple to us today, but I think it's easy to forget that people have been doing this for a really, really long time. Okay, moving forward just a little bit. I wanted to sort of include this next one, diverging paths, because I think it's interesting to think about how, as we move through time, people sort of respond differently to disease. So I'm including this because when we see sort of the rise of Christianity around 400 CE, we really see disease sort of being contextualized as like a moral failing. So if you think about like leper colonies, for example, people literally being banished for being sick, that sort of becomes more common. And at the same time, roughly, we also have in sort of the Middle East, North Africa, and southern Spain, the rise of the Umayyad and Abbasid caliphates, who are really responsible, and I could go on forever about this, so I won't, but my one sentence summary is they were primarily responsible for what we call the Renaissance in Western Europe, right? They are the ones who kept all of the knowledge, all of the arts about, knowledge about arts and medicine and science. They wrote it all down. They kept it somewhere safe. And then unfortunately, in 1258, the Mongols burned down the House of Wisdom where a lot of this stuff was stored. Big bummer of history. That's one of my favorite fun facts or sad facts, I guess. So all this to say, we kind of see, disease being maybe imagined or visualized in like two sort of different ways. And I think that's kind of interesting to think about as we move forward. Any questions at this point? I just like threw a lot of dates at you. So is anyone like wildly confused or any thoughts at this point? No. Okay, again, feel free to interrupt me at any points and I will keep myself moving. You can also ask me to slow down at any point. I know, as I told you, I could go on forever, so I'm trying to like keep myself moving. Okay, so our first sort of case study here I wanted to include is the Black Death, also known as the Black Plague. The main sort of wave that we think about when we think about the Black Death was between 1346 and 1350. And historians generally estimate up to 2/3 of Europe's population was wiped out, which is absolutely insane if you think about it. So let that sit for a minute. And I think it's also worth noting that this wasn't just happening in Western Europe. That's usually how we talk about it, but similar things were happening in East Asia across the Silk Roads that connected folks in Eurasia. And I also think it's really cool because when the Black Death was happening, they used like very modern day techniques to kind of deal with it. So they had quarantine, they had plague hospitals, they asked sick people to isolate, they wore masks. Granted, I don't know if you've ever seen a plague mask. I had a professor in college who brought one in one day when we were talking about this, and I have a photo on my phone, I won't show you, but they're like these really long, like beaked, they almost look like, I don't know, like ravens or crows or something, like those beaked masks that like absolutely did nothing to help protect people, but they were wearing masks, which I think is really cool. So I think that's worth pointing out. And then I'm including this also as a case study because I think this is one of the times that I could sort of pick out in the timeline when we see like very clear transgressions. So I don't know if you all are super familiar with this, but the plague was often blamed on Jewish folks and they were scapegoated. It was used by primarily Catholic institutions across Western Europe to commit genocide and ethnic cleansing of Jewish populations. And so I just wanted to kind of name that as sort of our first instance of public health transgressions, right? So we see disease emerge and we see somebody get blamed for it. And I think we're going to see that throughout this timeline. Okay. The next kind of two, I was going to do these separately, but I might just kind of lump these together because I think they're related. So we have sort of the age of colonization. Some of you might be more familiar with this being called the age of exploration. I'm intentionally calling it the age of colonization because that's what it was, right? There were people across primarily Western and Southern European countries who were going out and subjugating and oppressing people in other places. In the US context, of course, we can think about that in terms of South America, North America. But I just wanted to make sure I named that it was happening across the globe, right? So the Dutch were in Southeast Asia. The British were everywhere. At one point, they had like 80% of the land under their control or something. It's just nuts. So we see in this sort of time period, the decimation of indigenous populations. And I think one thing I wanted to make sure I said here is that, again, this was not an accident, right? So it's not like the Europeans rolled in and they all had immunity and like everyone died just because like they didn't have immunity, right? There was like a lot of social and political things happening, including war, including famine, intentional destruction of properties and resources, enslavement of indigenous peoples. All of this was sort of working together to facilitate the spread of disease. So again, not an accident. This happened on purpose. Moving forward a little bit, we have sort of the emergence of like modern science and the age of the Enlightenment, and also the vaccine, which I think is worth having on this timeline. So the invention of the smallpox vaccine. And one thing I wanted to say about that again is this was not necessarily like a Western invention. So they were actually using variolation in China for like a really, really long time. And I think, did I write it in here somewhere else as well? Oh, and parts of Africa as well, and other parts of Asia. So when Edward Jenner invented the vaccine, like that was really cool. And also like it had sort of already happened. So just wanted to note that. I think this time period is also interesting because this is kind of when we see the rise of industrialization. And as well, I shouldn't assume, as many of you probably know, with the rise of industrialization, we had the facilitation of a lot more kind of disease and sort of the evolution of like social disparities as we kind of see them today. So like social classes were like very well defined in this period, at least in the Western context. And I'm going to pause there. Questions or comments up to this point? Ben, go ahead.
There was one thought or question that came into the chat of why were Jews blamed for the during the Black Plague period? Do you have a thought on that tonight?
I do have a thought. I will say I'm not a Western European historian expert. However, I think the primary reason was convenience. Like they were sort of, if you imagine like smear campaigns, it was like smearing the Jews as like they are the carriers of this disease, which of course is insane and ridiculous. But yeah, I think it really boils down to like they were a scapegoat. There was no actual legitimate reason for it other than like we need to blame somebody. If that helps. But I also encourage you to do more research on it if you're curious.
Thanks, Sanaya.
Other questions, comments, concerns, feelings, thoughts?
I'm not seeing any.
Okay. Hopefully I'm not boring you to tears. I'm really enjoying this, but this is also like my jam, so. Okay. So we're at our next case study, and I do have more notes on some of these. We're going to come back to a few of these case studies in the second half of this training and give you all a chance to kind of think more about them, which is why some of them don't have notes underneath, but there are notes in the PowerPoint. So in the 1800s, we have experiments on enslaved women. I don't know how many of you are super familiar with this history, but there was this dude named James Marion Sims, who is disgustingly referred to as the father of gynecology. And essentially he performed non-consensual operations on enslaved women, most of whom had recently given birth and had complications from that birth. He didn't use any, anesthesia or painkillers. And he would say things like, he always had a subject for operation, but essentially what would happen is white slave holders would call him up and say, I have someone who, recently gave birth. She's no longer able to work. Can you, come do something about it? And when he did, he would like take ownership of those women, which of course, there's no way to consent in that situation. There's absolutely no way to consent. So this is a really disgusting period of history. And I think one of the ways, there are many, but one of the ways we see it play out today is this racial bias that he held in terms of like thinking that Black women didn't experience pain in the same way as white women really persists into today. And I don't have it on me, but as I was sort of researching more about this, I found some studies that show that that's still being taught in modern med schools. And a lot of doctors really still have that belief. It's like, it's a really, really high amount. I don't remember the exact number, but there was one study that said, I think about 75% of doctors had at least one of these sort of related biases in terms of how Black folks experience pain compared to white folks. And so I think this is important, one, because it was an utter violation of Black bodies, and two, because we still see its effects playing out today. Just wanted to sit with that for a moment. I'll kind of breeze through these next couple. So we have in sort of the mid 1800s, we have cholera emerge as sort of a pretty bad pandemic. And we see sort of the rise of public health in the West. That sounds like, I don't know, a book title or something, but this is sort of the time period when I think a lot of public health history starts. When we talk about it in the US, this is when we see Jon Snow come in and say, hey, why don't we turn off that tap in the middle of London and see if that helps people? So I won't spend too long here. One thing that I learned in this research, and I want to shout out Ben for finding this, is Lemuel Shattuck was really kind of responsible for the formation of the first Board of Health in the United States, which happened in Massachusetts, where I think many of you are located, which is pretty cool. For those of you who don't know, he was a teacher, a historian, and a statistician, amongst other things. And he was really, really concerned with a lot of public health issues that we still think about today, things like keeping vital records, establishing health records, and using statistics and probably what we'd call epidemiology to kind of like monitor and surveil disease. And let's see, he really wanted to improve sanitary conditions. And he studied things like tuberculosis. He was worried about mass communication related to public health. And he established a bunch of nursing schools, which I think is pretty cool. So that was in 1869, right? Well,
Can I jump in real quick too? I think one of the things that I find really interesting, so I'm a ex-local health director in Massachusetts. So anything that relates to specific Massachusetts local health definitely fascinates me. But one of the things that I think is really telling about Lemuel Shattuck in this study, which really was this watershed kind of moment that started formal governmental public health in Massachusetts and the United States, is that it really had, it really was sort of a utilitarian example of sort of a value in public health, and it was absent any any sort of feeling or language or understanding of equity, and that utilitarian sort of approach has been sort of the dominant public health mindset since Lemuel Shattuck's day, right? So like the idea that this scientific study, which definitely led to sort of responses around sanitary conditions, was one in which it was sort of framed as we need to change the conditions for these poor folks because it's impacting the lives of the wealthy, right? It was not necessarily we need to address these conditions because we need to be addressing these conditions. It was very much that sort of utilitarian view. Just wanted to share that.
Thank you. That's helpful. I appreciate that additional context. Looking at my time. Okay, we got time. Just check the chat really quick. Okay, perfect. And then the next sort of piece of this timeline we wanted to share was W.E.B. Du Bois, and he did these things called the Atlanta University Studies, which I'm embarrassed to admit I very, very recently learned about, as in studying. My head is like in such a school space, researching for this training. But I thought these were really cool. So it was around 1897, but I think obviously the study spanned a few more years than that. W.E.B. Du Bois took the time and effort to really like research and compile all of this different data around what we'd probably call like racial inequities in modern lingo. But it was the first study that took a scientific approach to looking at African Americans and really challenged scientific racism that was pretty prevalent at the time. This was around the rise of like the eugenics movement, and he was able to like show with data that these biases that white folks had, these assumptions that they had about Black folks, really were not based in anything related to race. And he was able to show like essentially the social determinants of health were at work. So all of these like social, economic, political contexts were like really working together to facilitate poor health outcomes. He talked a lot about things like redlining and racial covenants, which I think is super cool. And the sort of baseline takeaway here is that he was able to show that there was not an inherently racial like difference between races, but instead that, you know, these health outcomes he was noticing were rooted in societal factors. And I wanted to shout out Evelyn Hammonds, who gave a presentation on this. I was not actually at APHA, but Ben gave me his password and I was able to listen to this conversation and this presentation, and I thought it was really wonderful. So I hope I did it some justice, but Ben, if there's anything you'd like to add, please do. All right, I'll take that as I summarized it decently well.
Oh, totally. Yeah, sorry. I should have been more affirming. I will call out Tanayo that Sandra put in the chat that W. Du Bois was born in Berkshire County in Massachusetts. So
yeah,
good local tidbit.
Thank you, Sandra. Okay, so the next case study that we're going to return to later is what we call the Yellow Peril, legalized anti-Asian discrimination. The Chinese Exclusion Act was passed in 1882. It was the first act in the United States that prohibited immigration on the basis of ethnicity. And we don't see the end of like immigration quotas until 1965. In the early 1900s, there was a lot of fear around immigration, particularly from East Asia, and lots of obviously heinous racist rhetoric that was echoed. If you look at like newspaper clippings from that time, it's like really disgusting. I encourage you to do it for like a learning purpose, but just like noting it's really, really quite heinous. And we see again the formation of things like Chinatown, Japantowns, Koreatowns. Those all happened on purpose, right? That was not on accident. Those were usually the worst places to live. Usually people didn't have much of a choice. They were kind of forced into these areas of the growing urban cities and told to stay there. And of course, we see the same racism reflected today in the COVID-19 pandemic with anti-Asian racism. This one is personal to me. I'm part Japanese, and I was very, very worried about my grandmother throughout the pandemic, particularly as sort of the rise in racist rhetoric started. And my grandma was so funny. She was like, I'm 84. If anyone tries to hurt me, I'll just fight back. And I was like, all right, grandma, you weigh like 90 pounds, but whatever. I joke, but again, we see this reflected today, right? This didn't happen on accident, and this didn't just go away. So next we have the influenza pandemic and the invention of penicillin, my goodness. I won't spend too long here since this isn't a pandemic specific conversation, but I did think it was important to name since this was, again, sort of an instance when we see current public health practices being used, hand washing, quarantines, mask wearing, etc. And then, of course, we see the invention of penicillin a little bit later, which, as we know, has been wildly helpful in preventing disease and early death from infection. So the next couple of case studies before I dive in, I just want to pause. Are there any questions? Is this landing with people? Are you surprised by anything we've talked about? Give you all a minute. Take a sip of water. Okay. In that case, I will continue forward. But again, any questions, any comments, feel free to interrupt me. So the next case study we have on here is the Tuskegee syphilis experiments. I'm guessing based on the registration form that many of you are probably pretty familiar with this. So I'll just kind of run through the overall timeline. So we kind of start in 1932 when the study begins. So there were 600 Black men who were recruited into this study. 399 of them already had syphilis, 201 of them did not. But this is one of the times we see that there was no informed consent for the study. Let's see. Oh, thank you, Abak. I hope I didn't totally butcher that. Feel free to correct me, but thank you. So where was I? Yes, 1932. Okay. So in 1943, we see that penicillin is pretty widely used to treat syphilis. However, it was not offered to any of the study members. Jumping about 30 years ahead, in 1972, the Associated Press published a story on the syphilis experiments, and maybe to nobody's surprise, deemed it ethically unjustifiable, which essentially ended the study. About a year later, survivors were offered medical care, and they filed a class action lawsuit. And then later, once that was settled, I think the descendants of survivors were also offered medical care sort of longer term. And it wasn't until 1997 that President Clinton was like, hey, this was probably a bad idea, and issued a formal apology. But again, we see the use and abuse of Black bodies. We see there's no informed consent. And we can see how this is very much playing out today with the mistrust in many BIPOC communities regarding things like the COVID vaccine. The next case study is the forced sterilization of Puerto Rican women. This happened primarily between the 1930s and the 1970s. And one thing I wanted to point out here, I think this is one of those like kind of shady things that the US does when we teach history. And that's that we don't talk about how we were one of the first nations to codify eugenics. It happened in 1907 in Indiana. That was the first law passed related to eugenics. And in the 1930s, there were doctors in Puerto Rico who essentially like pushed women into being sterilized by hiding it as like a form of contraception. But they were given consent forms written in English. Many of them were not English speakers, and they were forced to sign away their rights. And the abuse wasn't exposed until the 1970s. We also see similar things happening to Indigenous women. And in modern day, we see this happen to incarcerated women. So again, this is not like a one-off. This keeps happening. Questions or thoughts? Dory, I saw you unmuted. If you wanted to jump in. Nope. Okay. Okay, and the last big case study that you all are going to have a chance to kind of think about later is the Havasupai Diabetes Project. And I don't know if any of you are super familiar with this. I wasn't, honestly, until I did some research. So again, I'll do my best to kind of represent the summary, but if you would like to learn more, I definitely encourage you to do so. But essentially in the 1990s, Arizona State decided they wanted to collect DNA samples from the Havasupai tribe members, and they framed it as researching for genetic variations that cause diabetes, which was fairly prevalent in the tribe at that time. They also said that they were working on a cure, so they were promised, tribe members were promised some sort of treatment for it. However, again, we see an issue of informed consent. So when they filled out the consent forms, they were under the impression that not only were they going to get a cure, but they were only doing research using blood samples on diabetes. However, what happened was one of the researchers was really interested in schizophrenia and decided to conduct additional research without consent. Of course, when folks found out about this, they were rightly furious. The sort of high level overview of what happened next was, again, there was a class action lawsuit filed and the blood samples were returned. And I think what's worth kind of naming here, that blood, and I'll just read the quote I have, you'll see these on the slides a little bit later, but blood is really essential for spiritual health. So one of the tribe members, Carletta Tolosi, said, when you have blood samples being held in a laboratory, the transition to the next world is not completed. That's why we need these samples. So not only were they lied to, not only did they take blood without informed consent, but this blood was essential to spiritual practices, and that was completely ignored. Questions or thoughts before I kind of roll through the last few pieces? Okay. So I'm not going to spend more than like a minute here. Just wanted to kind of name the next couple chunks of the timeline. So we have later in the 90s, later in the 1900s, the war on drugs, and we see mass incarceration, particularly of Black and brown young men. We have the opioid epidemic kind of emerging, but again, just wanted to name here, you know, we really don't see this becoming an issue until white folks start dying, right? So again, that sort of erasure of the experience of BIPOC individuals in this country. And then we land here in 2020 and we see sort of the evolution of the mistrust in COVID and the vaccine, and how communities addressed it. And we saw, I really think across the country, how the most effective communication about the vaccine was really when it was done by like a trusted community member. There was a lot of confusion at the federal level, I think we can probably all agree on, and maybe state to state, there was confusion between what the CDC was saying, maybe what your local health board was saying, what your state was saying. So there was a lot of stuff happening there, and I won't belabor this since we've all been living through it. But just wanted to say that we're landing here because what we just talked about, the case studies we just ran through, they all lead us here, right? So the transgressions that we saw really play into the mistrust that we also saw. I think that's all I wanted to say about that. But I want to pause again. I know this was a lot of me talking at you. I'll check the chat, but any questions, any comments, Ben, feel free to also jump in and add if I missed anything.
I don't have anything to add. Just want to lift up that there's a lot of appreciative comments in the chat tonight.
Oh, lovely. I'm glad this is landing with folks. And of course, I encourage you when you fill out the feedback form, if there's something that you thought was missing, like you can tell me now, or you can say that there. We want to make sure that we're, you know, being thoughtful about how we present this information. But that was a lot. And I'm like, I think I'm only 3 minutes over my time. Oh, go ahead. And Anida, feel free to correct me.
Hi, it's Anita.
Thank you.
So I wanted to ask it a little earlier, but I didn't quite have the formulation for the question. But between you and Ben, you two explained how that everything that you showed wasn't exactly inevitable. but it was because of the systems that were placed that this is how they carried, certain, everything that you showed. Do you think, depending on the earlier time periods that you mentioned, was there ever a place where it kind of wasn't reigned by systems, if that makes sense, that it was a time where people were treated equally, or through an equity lens, if that makes sense? I don't know if that makes sense.
That totally makes sense. I think that's a really interesting question. I don't know that I have a full answer to it. The best I can do is that if you read about sort of the evolution of like racism, I think it's really interesting to think about how that comes about, particularly after sort of the start of colonization. And I'm not going to do this total justice, but essentially it was like, I mean, we all know this, it was an invention, right? It's a construct, but if you kind of watch the transition between like, we have like no sort of conception of race to like, oh, race is the defining characteristic that will separate people out. I think that's a really interesting sort of chunk of time, because before then we don't really have that. So that's like a partial answer, but Ben, I don't know if you have thoughts. It's a really good question.
I just really don't have an answer. I think that judging by what you just presented, Tanayo, which is the first time I've seen you go through this timeline like this, and it was super fascinating. I would hazard an argument that that a systems of advantage based on race has been pretty baked in for a really long time. That is a take home for me based upon what you just presented. So I don't know where in the line that sort of got baked in, but it's been baked in for centuries and centuries and centuries. So that's how I think I would answer it.
Any last questions? We are going to take a break after this and let you all breathe and walk away for a minute, but I want to make sure I'm not missing anybody. Do the LJ 10-second countdown.
I will lift up the comment from Allison in the chat, who is an epidemiologist from Arizona, which is amazing to have you here, Allison. She had not heard of the Havasupai Diabetes Project information before, which I think is just telling that this is a way of trying to hide reality by not talking about it and not including it in sort of in the formal public health spaces in which a lot of us inhabit. So thanks for lifting it all up tonight.
I think I'll stop sharing and let's go ahead and take that 10-minute break. Eli, do you mind throwing up a timer? Jeez, I was going to say timeline, not another timeline, I promise. A timer, please.
Naya, it's me, right? I'm up. All right, Eli, thanks for that. So I'm an ultimate Frisbee player, guilty as charged. And last night I played indoor ultimate Frisbee, and the game was late. It was 8-9, and is on this like super hard turf, and it does not make my old body feel very good, even though I have a tremendous amount of fun doing it. So thank you for the little stretch break, Eli. Was good for me. All right, so folks, hope you learned something and gave you something to think about as Tanaya was going through that very deep and long 10,000 year long history of public health across the world. So we want to fast forward to the future. We want to fast forward to the present. We'll go into the future. but we want to fast forward to the present and talk a little bit about the current moment that we're in and what this sort of thinking of the past can do for us, thinking about moving forward. So clearly we are in a unprecedented period of time for public health. I say unprecedented, but certainly unprecedented in my lifetime. So I don't, that's my frame of reference. So and it's unprecedented, obviously, because of the spotlight that has been put onto public health because of the pandemic, but also because of the amount of resources that are flowing through the field right now. Like it is the amount of investment that's being made in the public health system, sort of broadly understood and considered, is really momentous, and it is going to be a time we look back on either with great regard, like we did what we thought we needed to do with all that massive investment, or it's going to be one of those periods of time where we look back and we don't know what we did with all that money, and what did it actually do to change and shift the field of public health. So what we wanted to do now, you can put next slide, Eli, is just situate ourselves in some of the current thinking in the field about what needs to happen moving forward for public health, so that we can understand what sort of the establishment, for the lack of a better word, don't say that with sort of a negative connotation, it just sort of is what it is, right? It's the sort of the establishment figures in public health and dominant institutions that drive a lot of thinking around what public health is all about. And there have been a huge bevy of reports that have been put out by major institutions in the past 2 years to try to drive thinking about what needs to happen. And these 6 sort of categories of potential change are widely shared across a lot of those different reports. This comes directly from this report called The Future of Public Health, which was put out by the National Network of Public Health Institutes, and like using this one just because it was a big synthesis report. So they basically looked at all of the different publications that had been put out and published in a couple of year period of time during the pandemic to try to get a sense of what everybody was talking about as needing to shift and change. So this is what these 7 big categories are. Again, these are widely shared, not just this is from this one report, but this is super widely shared. So data, super big issue. Public health system currently anyway is characterized by a lack of standardization around data collection. There's inefficient data exchange. There's a lot of disease-specific data systems that are not integrated across each other, so it makes sort of really understanding the complexity of what we know drives disease, for even specific diseases, inadequate. So data is this big category. Workforce is another huge category. So just from the standpoint of retirements and just growth in the field, there's an estimate of the public health workforce needing to grow by 100,000 people to just meet some basic standards, and also sort of thinking about what that workforce needs to look like. So a big emphasis on shifting and changing what is very much a white-led field to one that is much more representative of the country's actual demographic makeup. And skill sets to implement the public health standards that have been articulated again and again. Funding. So there is obviously a massive amount of funding that has been injected into the field, billions upon billions of dollars in the past 2 years. But there's a need for more sustainable funding mechanisms, and a recognition that public health generally goes through these sort of peaks and valleys of funding without any sort of real dedicated and consistent funding at a level that is necessary to meet the actual need. law and policy. So this is a one that consistently gets lifted up as well. So a recognition that the sort of the movement to address health inequities caused by racism and other structural and social determinants of health really can only be shifted and changed if public health gets more explicit about understanding how to use policy and legal levers to address the conditions that lead to inequity. And that is a sort of a space that public health has obviously been historically been involved in regulation and in policy, but the needs to sort of move more formally into public health's role in addressing social policy as well. Multi-sector partnerships. So this imperative on understanding that government is unable to create health by acting alone. That's super relevant, everywhere, but it's really relevant in the United States, where there's a big, we have a very decentralized public health system in the United States. So the idea that government can be the agent of change on its own is false. And so the need to be engaged with all sorts of different sectors to affect community change. Quality improvement, that's what QI is. So this comes up in most reports as well. And there's this movement around accreditation for public health, and the idea behind accreditation being that there are specific standards, and there's sort of there's a need to inject a sort of a culture of really learning about whether or not public health organizations are actually accomplishing what they are setting out to accomplish. So really sort of building in a focus on quality improvement, and then building trust. This comes up again and again. It's a key priority for the public health sector to rebuild the public's trust as sort of core work for the field. This is obviously a huge piece of conversation that has been lifted up as a result of the pandemic, but it is one that has been building obviously over a very long period of time. So just want to take a pause there and ask if these themes are resonating with folks. Is there anything that's super big that you see missing? And Tanayo, I have not been paying attention to the chat, so if there's anything in the chat, let me know.
Nothing yet.
Okay. All right, Sandra. All right, so I will move forward then. So let's talk a little bit more specifically about trust. So the problem is real. If that was something new to folks. So this is just one data point. Could have picked out millions of different data points to make the same case here. So this one comes from Harvard School of Public Health. Found that only 41% of Americans polled actually trust the recommendations of their state health departments. A great deal. And 44% expressing that level of trust in local health departments. So that is telling about the actual current state of public understanding of what it is that public health departments and officials are actually trying to accomplish and do. Next slide, please. So just to come back to this, to these reports that have been coming out, and a lot of which emphasize trust as sort of a major issue. These are three solutions. Three causes of a lack in trust in public health that are repeated frequently. So one being the influence of partisan politics, and then misinformation and disinformation. So the active or the passive use of information and communication to undermine some of the messages that the public health field is putting out. So these three these three issues are consistently raised up as key contributors or causes of a lack of trust in public health: influence of partisan politics, misinformation, and disinformation. Next slide, please. And so the types of solutions that have been coming up in some of the dominant reports and organizations that are leaders in the field of public health that relate to those particular types of causes. So safeguards from political influence, developing better communication skills and spokespersons, actively countering false narratives, so working against the tide of misinformation that is out there, and then this final one of engaging trusted community members to counter false narratives. So let's hold those causes and these common solutions that are talked about, and then come back to we're going to actually look at some Massachusetts data, and then we can come back to these. Next slide, please. So these data come from the COVID Community Impact Survey, the CCIS, which the Massachusetts Department of Public Health implemented in the fall of 2020, and is a tremendous data source for those of you who do not know it. It is was sort of like a watershed, in my opinion, a moment where the department tried to collect data in ways in which it has in the past. We can talk about the CCAS for hours, so I'm not going to do that. But what this particular data from the CCAS shows is that the experience of discrimination during the pandemic was not evenly felt. And it shows that non-white populations in Massachusetts experience discrimination at far greater rates than the white population. What you can see here is in very small font, but you can see that in some cases there was experience of discrimination was 12 times greater for Black and Asian populations than it was for white folks in Massachusetts, which is really a pretty astonishing figure. Next slide, please. So then, of course, those experiencing discrimination, it's not just a, which I think is somewhat commonly sort of thought of. It's not just a, and it's not separated from other types of impacts, right? So what the CCAS showed is that those folks who were experiencing discrimination also faced far-ranging negative outcomes, everything from less access to healthcare to being at higher risk of COVID complications, worrying about basic needs. So it is discrimination is an indicator of a broad range of negative outcomes. So given that this reality of experiences of communities of color in Massachusetts and these associated impacts related to things like meeting basic needs, accessing healthcare, et cetera, what do we actually think? This is not a rhetorical question. What do we actually think about the dominant explanations of the causes of lack of trust in institutions and public health in particular? So things like lifting up partisan politics. And what do we think about their offered solutions, like highlighting the need for better spokespersons? Do we think that those causes and those solutions are adequate to actually address these data and these experiences that are being felt by communities of color in Massachusetts? Next slide, please. So this is an alternative. And this comes from a great article called Institutional Distrust Among African Americans in Building Trustworthiness in the COVID-19 Response, Implications for Ethical Public Health Practice. What is laid out in this article is not on its own in laying out sort of an alternative way of thinking about trust. As a cause, the need to emphasize accumulating injustices. So Tanayo, I think, did a amazing job at describing how injustices accumulate over an incredibly long period of time, and it's not just these point in time examples of injustices like the Tuskegee experiments, which I think are lifted up again and again and again, and they're incredibly important, those point in time examples, but they are not also adequate to the task of really describing the accumulated injustices that have happened over obviously an incredibly long period of time. So if accumulated injustices is the frame and the cause that we are centering our understanding of a lack of trust around, then I think the strategies would look different. And in this article, they lay out truth and reconciliation as being a major strategy. So actually recognizing that injustices have happened, and public health as a field has been a major contributor to those injustices. Really focusing on community-centered public health practice, elevating trusted sources, and leveraging intergenerational communication. And that last piece is super important too, right? And it ties back to the lessons of history, so that we are learning from folks who experienced what it was decades ago, as we're sort of thinking about the current reality. So pause there. What do we think about these causes and the solutions that are being raised up in this alternative viewpoint to the dominant causes and solutions that have been described by folks in the field?
Just want to jump in really quickly. There's a few comments in the chat, Ben, if you wanted to look at those. I don't have answers, so.
Okay. All right, where do I start?
Lauren, I believe at 10:47 my time, 11:47.
Oh, Lauren, that's a great question. I can send out. There's actually like there's a formal distinction between misinformation and disinformation, and I think that there's to put it sort of super plainly, it's a distinction between actually trying to create a false narrative that is versus information that might just not have the same sort of deliberate attempt at creating distrust in the formal sort of scientific information that the public health field is being put out. We can share some actual formal definitions of misinformation and disinformation to folks. Comment from Sandra saying, I think the mixed changing messages play a big role. We don't do a good job telling people that better data lead to changing recommendations. And we did a really poor job in the beginning of the pandemic about masking respiratory infections. Yes, Sandra, I couldn't agree with you more. And the way in which I'm interpreting that comment, Sandra, is that there's almost there's a lack of humility that is sort of baked into how public health operates, and it's a very difficult sort of space to be in, to be able to sort of honestly say, maybe we don't know all the answers right now, right? And we're going to continue to learn as new information comes in. That's an uncomfortable space for public health folks to be in, but I think you're 100% right. It definitely led to a lot of issues. Oh, and then I misheard what organization was referenced. This is relating to the COVID Community Impact Survey, ABAC. So the COVID Community Impact Survey is CCIS. We can drop in a link to the Massachusetts Department of Public Health CCIS website, where you can access the slides that were presented around discrimination and many, many others. There's a slide deck that, I'm not exaggerating, is over 400 slides long. That has just the most amazing contextualized information about the impacts of the pandemic in Massachusetts. So thank you for those questions and comments in the chat, folks. Tanayo, maybe we should just jump right into the next exercise.
Sounds good. All right, so what we have for you next is really, we're thinking about this as sort of tying together what we did before the break and what Ben just spent some time kind of talking about in terms of moving forward in this field. So I was trying to figure out the smoothest way to do this. I'm not 100% sure this is going to be the best, but Eli, can we share the Google Slides like on your screen? And then if you don't mind popping the link in the chat as well, I think that might be the easiest way to explain this so that people don't get confused. But just to preface, we're going to be setting you into breakout rooms and you're going to have a chance to self-select into a breakout. And we're kind of encouraging you to think primarily about one of 5 case studies. But of course, like I don't want to halt conversation related to others. It's more just to kind of help break you all up so it's not just like chaotic. But we have 5 case studies that will be listed in the Google slide link that you will get momentarily. And I think Eli is pulling up the slides just to show you. So if we head to slide 2, that will have the instructions, if you don't mind. And as you're kind of clicking into that link, please let us know if you can't open it or if there's any issues. But basically, we're going to think about these case studies as sort of our reference points to imagine the best possible version of public health. So there's 5 questions in here. You do not have to talk about all of them. You don't have to talk about any of them if they're not resonating. But just a few things to think about really around mistrust. So how has this come up in your work? Are you having conversations about it? Maybe does this case surprise you, or are there things you would add? Thinking about, what do you think is the most appropriate way to address this history that we talked about? Again, there's no right answer. I don't have the answer, right? Like, this is really just kind of a thought exercise. Like, how would you do it? What do you think is appropriate? What do you think is just? And then thinking sort of more about the stuff Ben just went over, thinking, how do these case studies inform the present findings that we just talked about? And do you think these documents do a good job of capturing the future of public health? So really kind of getting at that bigger overarching question that we have italicized and bolded. So imagining the best possible version of public health. I don't know if any of you have read Candide, but I kind of thought about it when I was writing this, like the best of all possible worlds. So that's kind of what I want you to think about. In your ideal world, what would public health look like? What would we do? Okay, so hopefully I haven't confused you all, but you should all have the link now. Any questions about these instructions? And then I'll kind of walk you through joining a room, but just want to make sure that it's clear what you're doing. And I see some of you are already in the Google Slides. Amazing. Okay. So what's going to happen is I'm going to open the breakout rooms. You have 10 groups to choose from. I encourage you, if you see one room filling up really fast, maybe jump into another room. If you can't join a room, we can put you in one, so don't panic. So I'm just going to do that as I'm talking, and hopefully it will make more sense. And then we'll be in there for about 15 to 20 minutes, kind of depending, and we'll check in and see if you all need a little bit more time. Feel free to take notes on the Google Slides. I should have said that first. That's why they're there. If you want to write down the things that come out in your group. Okay. I'm going to open the rooms. Feel free to start joining and let us know if you have any issues. Let us know if you can't get in, if you can't open the Google link. And no worries if y'all have to step away. Thank you so much for coming. But let's see how we're doing. All right. So you should all have seen a pop-up. And I see one person has joined. So are folks having a hard time getting into their groups? I see another person has joined. Or maybe you're just thinking, and I need to stop talking. I'll do that.
I feel like I'm kind of lost. I don't have a pop-up. Am I supposed to go to the Google Slides and it says I'm leaving the Zoom?
No worries. Okay, so Wendy, why don't you hang with us for just a minute? And so there's just like a bunch of names on my screen. So let's let a few folks kind of trickle out and then we'll help you get where you need to go. So if you don't have a pop-up, just hang out here for a couple of minutes and we'll get you to a group, I promise. Just give it like 1 more minute, let people trickle in. Getting there. I know this is always hard because not everyone has the capability to join their own room, but wanted to give you all choices. That's true. Thank you, Ben. Yeah. If you have a breakout room button on your screen, you can see if that's there and click on that. No, nothing. Okay.
Oh, I do.
Oh, yay.
And can you tell me again, the Google Slides, we're supposed to open up that slide deck?
Yes. If you can't open it, I'm assuming someone in your group will be able to. So you can just click the link open. It will take you out of Zoom, but it shouldn't kick you out of the Zoom entirely, in theory. Let me actually
Populated on the slide.
This meeting is being recorded.
Sorry.
Good. So we're interested in sort of hearing and understanding what kind of conversation you actually were having. What were the things that were coming up from you? What were the ideas and thoughts? And you know, if you have any really sort of bright ideas about what the future of public health really should look like, we're all ears for that too. But maybe we can go with group one. If there's somebody from group one who might want to share a little bit about your conversation.
Sure, I can jump in. And teammates, please let me know if I'm missing anything. So we had the example about experiments being done on enslaved women. And so we talked about how this actually really shows up in terms of people mistrusting the medical system now. People gave examples between violence prevention, smoking cessation, breast cancer screening, and also the vaccine hesitancy. So just thinking about like where that mistrust comes from. And I think the examples were really clear that Tanayo gave, that it actually comes from somewhere once you keep peeling back the layers of the onion. There were other examples that we thought of between maternal mortality, unnecessary C-sections, and then also providers not having any sort of training on culturally sensitive care, and what care might look like in the US could be totally different to what it looks like in another country. So we talked about the need for really doing more education for those providers so that they have the tools that they need when they're working with patients, and also shifted the conversation a little bit into reparations for people, and had a little conversation about how even no matter how much you pay, it's not going to fix the unjust behaviors and things that are still happening in terms of systemic racism. So, but it would actually help BIPOC have a little bit of a head start with some of that money that would come back to them. So that's our summary. Thanks to my team. Anything to add?
Any group one folks want to share anything else? All right, how about group two? Any reflections?
Hi there. I was in group two. There was just a few of us. We had a pretty small group. And most of us, I think, had joined this because we actually weren't very familiar with the Chinese Exclusion Act. So we all kind of were like, well, we would like to know more about this and sort of the history behind it. Jennifer from our group, I would invite you to give a little bit of an overview of what you talked about. But that was fascinating, and she had a little bit more of a personal connection to some of these to the Chinese Exclusion Act or the Asian. Jennifer, would you like to give a little overview?
Thank you, and I just want to thank the group for the great conversation and for this learning opportunity. And so I was just sharing that I'm Filipino American, biracial, bi-ethnic, and the Chinese Exclusion Act kind of extended not only just to Chinese, but to other Asian groups as well. And for Filipinos, there was also prohibitions against marrying white people, for example. So I had shared about how, those prohibitions against marrying outside of race were still on the books for many states until just a couple decades ago, even less so. Legally, my parents wouldn't have been able to get married. But we talked about just kind of in health disparities as well. When you look at grouping Asians together, when you have a huge population that globally represents most of the world, you have a lot of different health disparities. And so I shared, since the Philippines was colonized by Spain from 1521 until 1898, longer than the Spaniards were in Mexico, actually, there is technically we could be considered Hispanics, and we have a lot of the cultural similarities and traits and habits. So you'll see that in health disparities, we have more diabetes and cardiovascular disease than, for example, Korean Americans would have, or Chinese Americans. And so one of the things we talked about is maybe for more health equity is to try to the extent possible, to disaggregate some of the health data to better target Asian American communities, because when you take a huge area globally, geographically, culturally, and try to distill it down to one racial group, you're not truly getting to the disparities or to the inequities that are going on. And so it's really to understand the patient population to serve better for public health. It's good to know kind of the background and what those different communities are facing. Because if you look at the outcomes, for example, the health outcomes among Hmong populations versus Korean populations, or Bengali populations versus Afghani populations, there's a huge difference. And in order to really have equitable services for health among the Asian population, then we need to better understand those differences to help provide better services. Thank you.
Jennifer, thank you so much for the personal story, and also that tremendous example and challenge to the field around actually being able to tell the story of distinct population groups in ways that don't continue to lump folks together in ways that cause harm. I wanted to, not that I am just a hype man for the COVID community impact survey, but I kind of am. The CCIS really did do wasn't perfect by any shape of the imagination, but it did a pretty good job, and a different job of population level disaggregation than other surveillance systems have in the past. And I would encourage you to go check out the AAPI slides of the CCIS, because they do a really good job of putting the issue that you laid out into context, and trying to actually lift up the stories of individual population groups and individual communities, like the Khmer population in Lowell, in the city of Lowell, for example. Thank you so much for that. Group 3, do you have any reflections? Anything to share out? Any brave souls from group 3? How about group 4? Any reflections? And how many groups were there?
We technically had 10 groups and 5 case studies. So where are we at? Group case study 4 is...
Anybody else? How about we don't have to do it by group. Does anybody else have any reflections or any comments to share?
Not to call y'all out, but I see group 10 took some notes, so group 10 would like to share.
Come on, group 10, you got it. You can do it.
That's me.
Thank you.
So I'm Allison. I work in Maricopa County. So we did the diabetes project. I had previously said in the chat that as someone who works in Maricopa County, like we do a lot of trainings, and I may have learned about it just in passing, but it's not something that's widely talked about, that has been widely talked about in recent discussions, especially because we work with Indigenous individuals for Maricopa County, because obviously where we are. We just basically talked about how we need to elevate the voices of those, you know, instead of being like going into meetings and being like, okay, tell us how we can make everything better, giving those groups like the voices that they need in the communities, instead of, you know, just being like, all right, that's great, like cool, like move on. You know, that's a lot of what people experience and things like that. So I just, from my personal experience, found it very interesting that, like, though it's a lot of us had no idea that this stuff happened, and you know, it happened at ASU. ASU's like right down the street from me, so it's just kind of interesting to see like how easily history can be hidden by even those people who live within it. So yeah, and I plan on going and talking in focus groups tomorrow, you know, when I'm in office with my people, so, and figuring out what's going on. Admittedly, that's not one of my focus groups in for me, especially in Maricopa County, but I really like knowing what's going on. So yeah. Anything else from group 10? We had some really good discussion. So
Any other group 10 folks want to share? Thanks so much, Allison. And thank you for joining from Maricopa.
yeah, it's a great place. It's actually cold and rainy right now, so you wouldn't expect that. So
all right, Tanaya, what do you think? Should we move on?
Yep, sounds like folks have shared what they would like to share, so thank you all. Yeah, let's go ahead and move on.
All right, Eli, I think we're going to bring up slides again. So we are going to sort of shift gears a little bit and just talk about a process, a very simple tool. It's probably one in which you've used before, that is really good at helping us to critique and challenge our mental models, and just provide some examples of ways in which we've seen it be used. And then we'll see. I think we're probably running out of time. We were going to do another small group activity, but we're just going to sort of play this as we go and see what time we have left. So, all right, next slide, please. All right, so back to mental models, right? So this is what we sort of started out the conversation talking about. Mental models, they influence how we actually understand issues around inequities, and they influence how we're trying to solve for them. They also influence who we engage in solution making and how we engage them. And it also influences our decisions around policies and practices and resource flows, those tip pieces of the iceberg. So this is a super simple way of getting into the process of exercising that mental model muscle. Next slide, please, Eli. So the 5 whys. If we were in a room, I'd ask people to raise their hand, and I could really quickly visually see if people have gone through a 5 whys exercise before. I bet many of you have. But as simple as it is, we find it incredibly powerful. And we find it to be a powerful tool and process that you can use again and again and again. You can use it by yourself. You can use it with your team. You can use it with a group of a different grouping of people who look different from you and bringing different perspectives into the conversation. And almost every single time, the process will identify other layers of causes of the issues that you're trying to work on and trying to solve. So the 5 whys, really what it's all about is trying to get past the superficial sources of health and racial inequities, and it is trying to really get a deeper sense of why certain populations are advantaged over others. And just a little quick note, as we've seen this sort of play out in other spaces, that it's really easy to just sort of immediately jump to racism as sort of the cause of everything, and that's not terribly helpful if you're really trying to get to a point of concretizing the types of issues that you're currently grappling with. And the nuances within different issues that you're trying to work on. So we're going to give you two examples of how this has played out from our own experiences, and then maybe we'll have some good conversation around it. So this first one comes from work that we're doing in Michigan, and the inequity that we were trying to sort of work through and talk about in Michigan. There was the reality that Black and Native American maternal and infant mortality rates are 2 to 3 times higher than the rates of white birthing persons and babies. And the traditional approaches that had been tried to react to that reality are the sorts of things that are here on the screen. So increasing access to affordable healthcare, implicit bias training for healthcare providers, which I think some of you folks were lifting up from the group 1 conversation, and increased access to fresh, healthy fruits and vegetables, sort of as maybe a key contributor. So those are some of the traditional evidence-based approaches that have been lifted up and tried by practitioners in Michigan. And then they went through this 5 whys process and exercise. Next slide, please. So actually just want you to just populate it and go through them all, Eli. Click 5 times there. All right. So the first why is that they came through in a group conversation as to why Black and Native American maternal and infant mortality rates were so much higher than their white counterparts, related to maternal stress. And so you would then ask the question of why does that maternal stress exist? Access to and utilization of quality, affordable pre and postnatal care. Why is there a problem with accessing quality care? Because there's a lack of trust in medical providers and healthcare institutions. And so that right there, if you stopped right there, we would probably lead us into implicit bias training, which is certainly an important strategy, but not necessarily the whole story of what needs to shift and change. So if you ask why, again, came up with the answer of multi-generational history of providers acting on implicit and explicit biases, and why the final answer that came up in this group context was medicalization of childbirth and devaluing traditional practices. Next slide, please, Eli. And so after going through that type of a deliberate process of trying to dig into the whys in that way that they did, they came up with different types of solutions than those traditionally shown to be the evidence-based solution. So the goal then was to shift from an impersonal medicalized birth experience to one in which tradition and culture were sort of held at the center of the experience of the birthing person. So strategies related to the mother and the family being seen as experts in the way in which they want to honor and go through their cultural priorities in the birthing experience. That there is a rich and supportive community environment that is outside of the medical complex. And then expanding pregnancy care and birth options so that midwives and doulas and birth centers were more available and in use and seemed to be okay, right, by the medical establishment. I'm going to run through another example. Thanks, Eli. This one actually comes from very personal experience. So this is a story that's very much probably relatable to folks who are in the local public health world, where restaurant inspections are front and center of a lot of day-to-day activity. So this particular story stems from the reality that Asian cuisine restaurants in this particular city were failing food inspection rates at high rates. And the idea there that if they're failing in food inspections at high rates, and they're putting residents and restaurant workers at risk. So traditional evidence-based approaches in the public health space might be to do things like issue compliance orders and fine, provide educational materials, and or place those restaurants on increased inspection cycles so that they are more regularly being seen by sanitary and public health inspectors. Let's populate it again. Let's go through the 5. Thanks. This is another example of digging into the causes of this reality using the 5 whys. So the first one that came up was lacking information related to food code standards. Asking why that is, and there being a lack of access to culturally and linguistically relevant information that was being provided by the health department. Why is that the case? Because information was only available in English. It wasn't seen as it's educational material, and public health workers were seen as threatening and not actually folks who are providing education, rather enforcement. Why is that? Because the sanitary code in Massachusetts was developed as an enforcement mechanism, and public health workers are often trained as enforcers and not as educators. And also the reality that most of the code inspectors in this particular city were white and male, and often dealing with populations that were non-white and not cis male. And so asking the question again of why, get to a place of like, we're actually sort of naming paternalism of the public health field, really sort of, we know what's best, you got to do it, you got to do what we say. And ingrained racial and ethnic biases. So using language of they, right? A lot of othering in terms of language that was being used and sentiment that was being shared by code enforcers in this particular city. So that why exercise led to other types of solutions. Next slide, please, Eli. Choosing education and relationship over enforcement. So focusing on public health workers themselves and capacity building. So code enforcers getting trained on cultural differences and talking about ingrained stereotypes and biases, identifying actual policy shifts. So going from a place of fines being the sort of the basis of operation to fines being a real last resort. And putting into place policies related to translation of materials and making sure some basic accessibility standards are being met. And then also direct support for the restaurants themselves. Instead of just putting all of the onus on the restaurants, actually trying to sort of figure out, can we bring in folks who are better situated to provide education than the code enforcers that were the ones who were being tasked to doing it. So those are just 2 examples of different types of solutions that can be identified if we're critiquing and actively working around identifying our mental models and what it is that we need to be doing differently. And Tanayo, I think we don't have time for any breakouts, I imagine. Is that right? Yes, I'm getting some affirmation there. So how about this, folks? How about we just spend a few minutes? Are there any examples that other people have experienced doing something like this, the 5 whys, or a similar type of exercise where they've seen the potential impact of rethinking approaches and other types of solutions that you want to raise up and give as examples to folks? Or are there examples of inequities and issues that you're currently grappling with where you could see going through an exercise like this that could be beneficial? It's a question from Lauren that says, more a question, how do we get people to care to have these questions and not be stuck in their mental models? Lauren, that's a great question. I would love to hear what other folks in the space would share as a response. One of the things that I would say is that it's often who is in the room that really matters when you have these conversations. So bringing in different perspectives and trying to have a conversation outside of maybe the spheres where you maybe are feeling currently stuck is certainly a key strategy. Another one is to going back to the initial slides, that groundwater approach. It's one example of many that does a really good job of using data to describe that racial inequities do exist, but it does so in a way that is sort of easily communicated and doesn't get sort of bogged down in a lot of potentially academic jargon and way in which public health folks speak. So often it's also a matter of how you talk about these issues too. I don't know, Tanayo, what would you say?
I don't know if I have too much more to add. I think your last point, Ben, kind of jogged something in me that I've been thinking about a lot as I've gone through. I'm only my first semester of my MPH program, but I've kind of already run into that barrier of like public health, like being an expertise or like a professional field can really be a barrier between like the people we're trying to work with and serve and uplift and ourselves. And so I think one of our challenges in this field generally is making sure that we're training people who want to do public health work to not think of themselves as those experts, like really to take the lead of the people that we're working with. And just to emphasize like working with and not like doing to, right? So that was my only thought. It's not probably very helpful, but.
Thank you. Any other questions that folks have, or any other examples of issues that you're currently grappling with where you think going through a thought process exercise like this could be beneficial?
One thought I had about how to get people to buy into the process. One thing that we talk about, my work is focused more on a regulatory process around healthcare, but in healthcare, they used to talk a lot about value and kind of assessing outcomes and getting reimbursed based on how your patient's outcomes are, as opposed to just providing a procedure and getting reimbursed regardless. But if there is a way to shift the process so that the work of the enforcers or their outcome is somehow tied to the outcomes of those in which they're assessing, then there is some buy-in in terms of wanting to invest in whatever, processes are necessary to get a better understanding of how to improve the restaurants and their compliance with policies. It's tying that directly back to the work of the enforcers and how they're assessed so that there is some mutual kind of accountability there.
Super helpful, Lucy. Thank you. Lucy is with the Massachusetts Department of Public Health, folks. Any other ideas or examples to lift up? What's a current issue that somebody is grappling with? I know you're grappling with something where you feel like maybe you're a little bit stuck in the same cycle of solutions and strategies and programs that you think needs to be challenged a little bit. Nobody? All right. Well, folks, I think then that what we were going to do, we were going to spend some time in breakout sessions where you were going to actually try to work through some examples using the 5 whys, but we really don't have time for that. So I think what we will do is wrap up, Tanayo.
Yep, that sounds good. So Eli, let's move to the next slide. Okay, wait, go back to the resources page. That's probably easier. So this is not an extensive list. These are just a couple of resources that y'all will have access to when we send out the slides. Sorry, next slide, please. And just to kind of preview our upcoming trainings, we're done for 2022 after this, but we will be back January 12th with another online training. Registration will be open soon. If you would like to join our newsletter, you can do so through our website. Eli, if you don't mind popping that in the chat, that would be awesome. And then we're also going to give you a moment while we have you all captive to take a look at our feedback form. If you don't mind opening that up, you can fill it out later if you don't have time right now, but we really would love it if you would fill out our feedback form. It doesn't take more than a handful of minutes, and we really value your input and your questions, and anything that we can do better next time. We will take that into consideration as we think about our trainings moving forward. And what's my last plug? I think that was my last big plug. So Eli, if you don't mind popping that into the chat. That rhymed. Beautiful. So we have a SurveyMonkey feedback form. And I don't think Gina was able to rejoin us. She unfortunately has a sick kiddo at home. So on behalf of Gina and the whole CHTI team, we're really thrilled that you spent the morning with us. Thank you so much for coming. And feel free to reach out with any questions or comments afterwards. Thank you.
Thanks for coming, folks. Bye.